So, that synthwave video went over pretty well. What's next? Something a little different. In Flames, the long-running Swedish metal act has had an interesting relationship with its fans over the years. Starting in 1994, they helped pioneer melodic death metal with a series of classic albums. As their worldwide popularity started to grow, they did the unthinkable. Their vocalist grew his hair out like this. Oh, and they stopped making death metal. Their core fan base obviously took this very well, which is why all the comment sections of their new music are so incredibly civil. But yeah, that's right. You read the title. I'm going to argue that post-death metal In Flames is, in fact, good, actually. But I will allow one big caveat up front. If you only like heavy, brutal music, need album art as indecipherable as the vocal growls, recoil in fear at the sound of a radio-friendly chorus, and need nothing but blast beats and demonic shrieks for your soundtrack when you burn down a church. Yeah, that's not really the In Flames vibe. But if you have a bit of an open mind and a tolerance for alt metal, I think you'll find there's plenty to enjoy across the entirety of their 3-decade career. Now, I'm going to do this in 2 parts. First, I'm going to speed round their entire studio album discography, giving you my score and overall summary of what I think of each one. Then, I'm going to explain why their midstream change of style didn't suddenly turn them into Limp Bizkit. So without further ado, let's get into this. This is the first In Flames album, but since Swedish bands at the time kept trading members around like Pokemon cards, it almost feels like it shouldn't count. It's the only album without vocals from Anders Frieden, and it keeps threatening to turn into an instrumental folk album every couple tracks. It isn't bad, it just doesn't feel like them. Now this feels like a proper introduction. From the opening notes of Moonshield, you know you're going to get some serious melody mixed with some serious metal. It definitely feels raw at times, befitting a young band, but on this album they'd already established a classic sound. A further refinement of the last album's formula, this is a paranoid concept album about technology and the apocalypse. It's also probably the most cohesive album they've ever recorded. No small feat considering the album's climax is, of all things, a Depeche Mode cover. Absolutely perfect. Their first album with what would be their longest lasting lineup is also the best in my eyes. Things hit the ground running with a vengeance on Embody the Invisible and don't let up until the album ends. They even threw a couple re-recordings of old songs on the track list, and it all just works. Things took a bit of a turn towards the mainstream on this album, with more clean vocals and a greater emphasis on hooks. But paired with some absolutely pristine production, this one still hits all the classic In Flames notes with flying colors. Ah, the turning point. Some people say you can still hear the echoes of death metal fans' whiplash to the stylistic switch-up this album brought. That being said, my only real problem with this album is the somewhat muddy mix, which detracts from the otherwise excellent blending of death and alt metal elements. The band's first real misfire, there was an attempt at a more atmospheric sound here, through heavier use of synthesizers and post-track interludes. Unfortunately, the songwriting is pretty generic most of the time, and the nu metal production aged this album instantly. Somewhat of a return to form, this wasn't going to bring back the old diehards, but it made a good case for the viability of the band's new sound. Plus, I like the variety of an album that can contain both a Take This Life and the title track. The Mirror's Truth absolutely slaps. It's a shame they spent so much of the rest of the album trying to remake it, because the more unique songs like Alias or The Chosen Pessimist hint at a more interesting project. It may be a tad overproduced, but this is easily their strongest project in years. This was the first album without founding member Jesper Stromblad, but the improved songwriting makes up for his absence. There's not much to say about this one. A few tracks stand out, but the production renders most of it pretty flat and uninteresting. They can't all be winners. This one certainly isn't. Aww. A very strong first half is let down a bit by a more uninspired second, but the strength of the singles shows there's still life in the group, if not very many original members. Now, if you'll notice, I'm not trying to downplay just how classic the early part of In Flames' career was. Seriously, if you've never heard these albums, go listen to them now, they absolutely hold up. Plus, it might make you understand why some people are so passionate about their dislike for what came after.
But wait!
You might say, aren't you here to defend those later albums? By your own scores, there's a clear difference in quality before and after their style changed. And I will grant you that point, hypothetical critic I've invented, but to see my point, we need to dig a little deeper. So far, I've mentioned how In Flames changed their sound without really describing it. Most immediately noticeable was the shift in vocal delivery. Death growls were rapidly being replaced by traditional screams and even clean vocals. But even more central to the style of the newer albums was the way songs were constructed. Early signatures like prominent harmonized guitar leads were toned down, replaced by parts that could be played live by a band with only 2 guitarists. Catchy hooks became more central elements, and the overall shape of songs began to fit the mold of what can probably be described as pop structures. Going back to those overall scores with this in mind, there is in fact a difference between older and newer albums, but I want to look at the level of individual songs. Here, I've marked every song across the standard edition track lists of every album I've already talked about. Songs I like are in green, ones I don't are in red. Clearly there's more green early on, but if you notice, there aren't any albums where that green actually goes away. Well, almost any. Battles aside, there are always more than just a couple good songs here and there. And looking at the tracks broken down like this, I find that most of the albums seem to have the same problem. There's usually about an EP's worth core of good songs, surrounded by filler. This definitely could have been a problem at the time of release, but music exists in a whole new world now. As I'm sure we're all aware, the idea of the album as a cohesive work unto itself has not been the mainstream standard for a long time. iTunes and its single-song purchases revived the primacy of the single, while the advent of streaming didn't so much revive the album as much as it presented an opportunity to get a whole bunch of songs added to playlists. Ahem. And while I personally love few things more than starting a favorite album at the top and listening all the way through with no skips, I think we've established that these aren't those kinds of albums anyway. In fact, the playlist-focused streaming world of today presents a new opportunity to revisit the In Flames catalog in a way that highlights their long and varied career. So, in no particular order, here are a couple reasons why I think you should give In Flames' newer work a chance. To the hardcore fans, the only descriptor necessary for the newer music is not death metal. But assuming that isn't a deal breaker for you, there's a huge variety of tracks to discover. Want something fast and thrashy? Listen to Take This Life. Looking for old school Linkin Park-esque nu metal? Check out The Quiet Place. Want something poppy that can still accurately be described as rock music? The End has you covered. Songs sounding too samey across a single album may be a trap newer In Flames fell into, but jumping between them as we can now alleviates that entirely. Early In Flames lyrics were typically written in Swedish, then translated to English, resulting in some occasional awkwardness and creative pronunciation. However, the band's songwriting abilities grew over the years, and their later works really show that off from time to time. Huge ballads like Evil in a Closet or Come Clarity are particular standouts, and wouldn't have even made sense in the context of earlier albums. Rock music as a whole might not be in the greatest place right now, but if you do have a favorite modern metal artist, the odds are pretty good they were listening to In Flames when they got started. Multiple generations of metalcore acts in particular cite them as a key influence, from Trivium to As I Lay Dying to Bury Tomorrow. Many of these artists were influenced by the whole scope of In Flames' career, not just the early classics. If there's any big takeaway from this, it's that today's musical infrastructure has made it easier than ever to access and rediscover artists' back catalogs. Despite the bad rap they get from the purists, I think In Flames has a wealth of great music to check out, if you only dare look.